The wedding hall glows in soft amber light strings of fairy bulbs, cascading down from the ceiling like a canopy of stars. White satin bows hug the backs of polished wooden chairs, and the air smells faintly of roses and perfume. I walk slowly down the aisle, my shoes sinking into the plush carpet, my heart racing faster than the music the string quartet is playing. It is supposed to be a joyous occasion, my son's wedding, his chance at a life he once told me he could only dream of. But the moment I see the rows of chairs at the front, something tightens in my chest. The cards. They sit on each seat, like little judges, white with silver cursive lettering, reserved. For the bride's parents, her siblings, a grandmother flown in from Florida, even a distant cousin I've never met. I scan every row, my eyes tracing each card, willing my name to appear, needing to see at least one chair that says mother of the groom. But there is none. I stand frozen for a moment, clutching my clutch purse so hard the beating bites into my palm. I lean toward an usher, my voice softer than the harp music. "Excuse me, could I sit near the bride? Near my son?" Before the usher can answer, I feel a shadow at my side. My son. His face is flushed, his jaw tense beneath the boutonniere pinned to his lapel. He doesn't smile, doesn't whisper gently the way a son might when reassuring his nervous mother. Instead, he hisses sharp as a snapped twig. "Mom, you're embarrassing me." The words cut through the music louder than the violin, louder than my heartbeat. For a second, I think I must have misheard him, that perhaps stress twisted his tone. But the look in his eyes confirms it, irritation, not tenderness. My cheeks flush hot, and I feel every gaze on me though no one is looking. Shame spreads across my skin like fire under glass. I nod quickly, swallowing back the lump in my throat, and murmur, "Of course." My voice sounds foreign, as if it belongs to a woman I don't know. I step back, let him walk away, and force myself to keep breathing. The usher clears his throat and gestures to a row halfway back beside strangers I've never met. My legs feel heavy as I move toward the seat, my dress catching slightly on the chair as I sit down. I smooth the fabric as though pressing down my humiliation with it. Around me, guests smile and chatter, flipping through glossy programs that outline the ceremony. Their laughter floats above me like bubbles I cannot reach. I try to focus on the bride walking down the aisle, radiant in her lace gown, her veil shimmering in the light. The guests rise to their feet, a sea of bodies parting to welcome her. I rise too, clapping softly, smiling tightly, pretending my heart isn't splintering. I glance toward the front where my son waits with a nervous smile for his bride. He looks so much like the boy who once clung to my hand in a school auditorium. But the boy is gone, replaced by this man who has pushed me to the margins of his life. Each camera flash feels like a reminder. I will not appear in the photos that matter, the ones framed on mantles, posted on social media, tucked into albums. I am not part of the story they are writing. I am an extra, a body filling space in a room where my presence is tolerated but not celebrated. As the vows begin, I fold my hands in my lap, gripping them so tightly, my knuckles whiten. My son's voice is strong, his promises clear. I should be proud, I tell myself. I should feel joy. But all I feel is the hollow ache of erasure. Betrayal doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers in the placement of a chair, in the absence of a name on a card. When the minister pronounces them husband and wife, the room erupts in applause. I clap too, my smile plastered across my face, though my stomach twists. I can feel the strangers beside me stealing glances, perhaps wondering why the mother of the groom sits so far back. I wonder it too. During the recessional, the newlyweds glide down the aisle, hands clasped, faces glowing. My son doesn't look at me, not once. My heart lurches as the procession continues, each pair of attendants passing by with practiced grace. I feel invisible, though. My body is solid, though my heart is pounding so hard I think it might crack my ribs. At the reception, the theme continues. Tables closest to the dance floor bear little placards with names, the bride's family, her friends, people who belong. My name is not among them. Instead, I'm directed to a table near the back, close to the doors where waiters carry trays of champagne. The clinking glasses and cheerful chatter around me feel distant, muffled, as if I'm trapped behind glass. I stir the bubbles in my drink with a straw, watching the newlyweds dance under the spotlight. Their smiles light up the room, and the guests cheer, as though they are watching a scene from a fairy tale. For a moment, I imagine myself standing at the edge of the dance floor, my son extending his hand to me, pulling me into the circle of light. But the fantasy fades as quickly as it forms. I remain seated, my hands folded, my smile tight. When the photographer makes rounds, snapping pictures of families clustered together, I try to rise. My son waves me off with a quick gesture, almost imperceptible, but clear enough. Not now. I sink back into my chair, my chest tight, my throat raw. The betrayal is not loud. It does not arrive in accusations or slammed doors. It arrives in a seating chart, in a whisper, in a gesture that tells me I am too much, or not enough, or both at once. I lift my purse onto my lap, running my fingers over the beading. It is the only thing anchoring me, proof that I still exist in a space where my name has been erased. And I think, with a clarity that burns, this is not about a chair. This is about being written out of the story I helped create. The card on the chair was louder than his words. After the wedding, after the hollow clapping, and the quiet ride home, I sat in my dark kitchen with my shoes kicked off and the dress still clinging to me like a lie. My body ached, but the ache wasn't from standing too long or smiling too hard. It was older than that. It had been building for years, tucked into the corners of sacrifices no one remembered but me. That night, my mind slid backward, unspooling memories like a reel of film I hadn't asked to watch. I remembered the spring of his prom. Money was tight, the kind of tight where I clipped coupons and skipped meals to keep bills paid. He wanted a suit that would make him look sharp, like the boys whose fathers took them shopping at department stores. I couldn't afford a tailor. I stayed up late with a borrowed sewing machine, adjusting sleeves and hemming pants. I pricked my fingers until they bled, but by the time he stepped into that suit, he looked like the prince he wanted to be. I stood behind the camera that night, taking photos of him smiling with his date, and told myself it was worth it. That same year, I put off going to the dentist. My molar throbbed each time I chewed, but his college textbook list had arrived in the mail, thick, heavy volumes with prices that made me nauseous. I pulled from my small savings the envelope I had hidden in the back of the freezer and paid the bookstore cashier in crumpled bills. I told myself I could live with the pain in my tooth. What mattered was his future, not my comfort. I thought back to the mornings when I woke before dawn, pulling on my uniform for the diner. I'd serve eggs and coffee to construction workers, teachers, and retirees, the tips adding up slowly, never enough, but something. On those mornings, I packed him lunches with little notes folded inside. Do your best. I love you. You're stronger than you know. I slipped the notes into his bag quietly, never asking if he read them. I just believed love found its way somehow. When his father left, or maybe I should say, fled, because that's what it felt like. I became the only steady thing in his world. I tried to make our home soft, even when money made it hard. On birthdays, I baked cakes from scratch, improvising with margarine when butter was too expensive. On Christmas mornings, I strung dollar store lights across the living room, hoping their glow would distract him from the absence under the tree. He never complained, not once. His silence felt like gratitude back then. But years have a way of recoloring silence. At the wedding, when he hushed me like a child, I realized his silence may have been something else entirely. Perhaps shame, perhaps resentment, perhaps the seed of dismissal already sprouting. My memory drifted to the day he packed his things and moved into the apartment with his fiancée. I had brought lasagna, my mother's recipe, warm and bubbling in the glass dish. It was supposed to be a gesture of welcome, something that said, "I'm here and I'm happy for you." She smiled when I arrived, polite but cool, her eyes darting to him as though to check if my presence was approved. When she leaned in to kiss his cheek, her glance carried a flicker of something sharp. A look that said, "She's too much." I noticed, but I ignored it. I told myself she was nervous, adjusting, protecting her new space. I told myself not to make waves. So I set the lasagna on the counter, fussed with the oven mitts, and pretended I didn't see the quiet tension in the room. Later that evening, when I left, I noticed the dish, untouched foil, still tight across the top. The memory stung harder in hindsight. That lasagna was more than food. It was hours of stirring, layering, seasoning. It was a recipe passed down from my mother, who used to make it when we had family gatherings in our small kitchen. By leaving it untouched, they had dismissed not just dinner, but a piece of my history, my effort, my care. I thought about the dozens of other meals I had cooked, the birthdays. I had tried to brighten the hours I spent waiting in parking lots while he practiced football or studied late. I thought of the car I kept running far past its expiration just so he could use it to drive to campus. Every sacrifice was small in the moment, but together, they built the scaffolding of his future. And yet at the wedding, there was no recognition of that scaffolding. There was no chair reserved for the hands that had stitched and saved and served. There was only the sharp whisper of shame. "Mom, you're embarrassing me." I poured myself a glass of water that night in the kitchen, the sound of the faucet filling the silence. I stared at the bubbles rising in the glass and thought about all the times I had poured from myself until I was nearly empty. He had sipped freely, never asking where the water came from, never noticing when the well grew shallow. And now, at the moment when I expected to be seen, I was invisible. I wanted to rage, to slam the glass against the counter, to scream into the dark that I deserved better. But rage felt foreign to me. Sacrifice had trained me to swallow it, to smooth it over with patience. Instead, I sat at the table tracing the condensation on the glass, letting my mind move backward and backward, cataloging each quiet act of devotion that had been erased by one public act of dismissal. The lasagna, the prom suit, the textbooks, the dentist appointment skipped, the endless mornings in the diner, the notes in his lunch. All of it stitched together into a quilt he no longer wanted. The ache that night was not just from what happened at the wedding. It was from realizing the betrayal had roots deep and spreading. The wedding was not the beginning. It was the flowering of something that had been growing in silence for years. I leaned back in my chair, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the tick of the clock on the wall. The house felt too big, too quiet. I thought of calling him, of saying something, of demanding recognition. But the memory of his flushed face and his whispered words kept me still. To call would be to beg. And I had begged enough in my life for time, for attention, for scraps of acknowledgement. Instead, I sat there until the first hint of dawn crept through the blinds, pale and cold. I knew in that thin light that something had shifted inside me. I couldn't name it yet, but I felt it, the faint outline of a boundary forming the quiet beginning of a refusal. The lasagna cooled untouched. The weeks after the wedding stretched long and empty like hallways with all the lights turned off. My phone stayed silent, the screen black, except for the occasional junk notification. No photos from the honeymoon, no quick check-in, not even a thank you card for the gift I had chosen so carefully. I told myself he was busy settling into married life. I told myself patience was a virtue. But patience began to taste bitter, like medicine left too long on the tongue. Each day, I scrolled through Facebook and saw other mothers posting glossy photos, arms wrapped tight around their sons, bouquets pressed to their chests, laughter caught in frozen frames. I scrolled until my eyes ached, until the hollow inside me felt bottomless. One night, I set the phone down and stared at the ceiling in the dark. The quiet was so complete, it seemed alive, pressing against my ears, reminding me of everything missing. I thought about calling him, but the memory of his words at the wedding stopped me. "You're embarrassing me." The phrase played on repeat like a cruel refrain. I began to notice the silence, not just in my phone, but in my house, in the spaces I moved through each day. The fridge hummed, the clock ticked. The wind rattled the old screen door, but none of it filled the void. The silence wasn't absence anymore. It was presence, heavy and undeniable. There were no words that night, not even in my head. I poured coffee into a chipped mug, the dark liquid steaming, the spoon clinking softly against the ceramic. I carried the mug to the table and sat down alone. The fork scraped across an empty plate, its metallic echo sharp against the stillness. I chewed slowly, though the food tasted like cardboard. My eyes drifted to the chair across from me, vacant, shadowed, untouched. I did not cry. I did not speak. The silence itself was the language. When morning came, I tried to fold myself back into routine. I went to the grocery store, smiled at the cashier, waved at neighbors from my porch. But everything felt like pantomime, a hollow rehearsal of life I used to believe in. One afternoon, while clipping coupons at the kitchen table, I ran into Mrs. Harlow, a neighbor who had attended the wedding. She approached me in the cereal aisle, her cart filled with boxes for her grandkids. Her voice was hushed, like she carried a secret she wasn't sure she should say aloud. "I wondered why you were seated so far back," she whispered. Her brow furrowed. Didn't seem right. Her words hit me harder than I expected. I had been carrying the humiliation like a private shame, convincing myself maybe I was too sensitive, maybe I had misread everything. But hearing someone else say it, that it was visible, that it wasn't just in my head, cracked something open inside me. I nodded, unable to form a reply. She patted my arm gently and moved on. But the echo of her words followed me down the aisle, through the checkout line all the way home. That night, I sat with the memory, letting it replay. The seating card, the strangers beside me, the hiss of my son's voice. But now I saw it through her eyes as something unjust, not just embarrassing. I was not imagining it. The betrayal had shaped substance. I thought about the lasagna untouched, the prom suit carefully sewn, the textbooks paid for with aching teeth and empty stomachs. None of it had been enough to reserve me a chair near my son. None of it had been enough to secure my place in his new life. For the first time, I stopped asking myself what I had done wrong. The question itself dissolved. Instead, a new question began to take shape. What happens when the silence is not my fault? I sat with that question, feeling both the sting of it and the strange relief. The silence had always felt like punishment, as though I had failed in some secret way. But maybe it wasn't punishment. Maybe it was exposure. Maybe it was revealing something I had refused to see. The realization was not loud. It didn't arrive in a burst of anger or tears. It arrived like the slow cooling of a cup of coffee steam fading into nothing. I looked at the mug on the table, the ring it left behind, and understood I could not keep waiting for a call that wasn't coming. My son's silence spoke volumes, and I was finally learning to hear it. The quiet in the room was louder than any voice. It was months after the wedding when clarity finally cracked through the fog. Until then, I had been drifting, surviving on habit, walking the aisles of the grocery store, folding laundry in the silence of my living room. The days bled together in muted tones, and I told myself perhaps this was just what aging meant, becoming smaller, quieter, fading into the corners of other people's lives. Then one Saturday morning, I stood in line at the grocery store with a loaf of bread and a carton of milk. Two women behind me chatted as if the world belonged to them. I didn't know them well, only by sight, acquaintances from church bazaars and block parties. Their voices rose above the beep of the register light with gossip. I heard they didn't want her sitting up front, one said, lowering her tone only slightly. The bride's family thought it would ruin the photos. I stiffened. The words pierced my chest before I could brace for them. The other woman laughed, a high sound that made me want to cover my ears. Well, you know, they wanted everything perfect, a certain image. I held my breath, waiting, praying they were talking about someone else. But the next words ended any doubt. The groom's mother, the first, whispered, "You know she's not exactly polished." I felt my throat close, the line moving forward without me. My hand tightened around the milk carton, the cool plastic biting into my skin. For a moment, I considered turning around, confronting them, asking how they could speak so carelessly within earshot. But my body stayed frozen, shame and fury tangling together like barbed wire. When I reached the cashier, my voice cracked as I greeted her, but she didn't seem to notice. I paid quickly and walked out into the bright sunlight, the bag swinging from my hand. The air smelled of asphalt warming under the sun, but I barely felt the day. My mind was replaying those words again and again. Like a cruel song stuck on repeat, ruin, the photos not exactly polished. It wasn't just my son's whisper anymore. It wasn't my imagination. The truth had been spoken aloud by strangers who had no reason to lie. The bride's family had seen me, judged me, and decided I wasn't good enough for their curated vision. And my son had agreed. He had allowed it, perhaps even supported it. When I reached home, I set the groceries on the counter and leaned against it, my body trembling. I had always told myself love was enough, that sacrifice and devotion would carry me through. But sacrifice does not polish shoes. Sacrifice does not erase lines on a face or soften calloused hands. Sacrifice does not buy a seat near the bride when appearances matter more than history. I walked to the mirror in the hallway, the one that had hung there since the house was new. I studied my reflection, silver strands in my hair, fine wrinkles around my eyes, the tired but steady gaze staring back. I didn't look like the women in glossy magazines or like the bride's mother with her salon hair and pearl necklace. I looked like myself, worn, yes, but also real. And suddenly, I realized real had never been what they wanted. That realization landed heavier than any insult. It shifted the ground beneath me. The betrayal was not about one wedding seat. It was about an entire choice to prioritize appearance over blood, to edit me out for the sake of perfection. I sank into the armchair by the window, watching cars pass by. The world outside looked the same, but inside, something cracked open. For the first time, I stopped searching for what I had done wrong. I stopped carrying the shame as if it belonged to me. It didn't. The shame belonged to them, to a family so obsessed with image, they had erased the very person who had carried him to this moment. The clarity stung. It burned like antiseptic on a wound, sharp but cleansing. My son had not simply forgotten me. He had allowed them to push me aside, to categorize me as unsuitable. The boy I had raised, the man I had celebrated, had become complicit in my erasure. I sat in that chair until the sunlight shifted across the floor, golden turning to gray. I thought of all the times I had folded his clothes, packed his lunches, prayed for his future. And I thought of the strangers who had taken precedence over me, their polished smiles cemented in the front rows of his new life. For the first time in months, my tears came hot and unstoppable. Not tears of confusion, not tears of begging, but tears of recognition. I cried for the years I had given, for the invisibility I had accepted, for the realization that love does not always protect you from betrayal. When the tears subsided, I felt hollow, but lighter, as if some weight had shifted. I wiped my face with the sleeve of my sweater and whispered to the empty room, "I see it now." That night, I wrote in my journal, my hand trembling, but steady enough. This is not my shame. This is theirs. The words looked foreign on the page, but also powerful. They marked a line I had never drawn before, a line between my worth and their choices. I closed the journal and sat quietly, feeling the stillness settle around me. The fog had thinned. Clarity had arrived, painful, but undeniable. Their elegance had teeth, but I had finally seen the bite marks. After the words I overheard at the grocery store, a kind of storm gathered inside me. It wasn't the sharp lightning of rage, not yet. It was a steady rolling thunder that made everything else tremble in its wake. For weeks I moved through my routines with a new clarity. I stopped checking my phone every hour. I stopped rehearsing excuses for him in my head. Something had broken, and once it broke, there was no patching it back together. I began to replay the wedding differently. Not as a blur of shame, but as a tableau of power. Every detail stood out the cards with reserved, written in silver, the bride's mother gliding down the aisle in her pearl necklace, the way my son's eyes slid past me as though I were scenery. Before I had thought my humiliation was private. Now I realized it had been orchestrated, a performance staged by people who wanted me invisible. That recognition filled me with anger. Yes, but it was anger that clarified, not destroyed. Anger that whispered, "You do not have to accept this anymore." I started to walk each morning, circling the block as the sun lifted over the houses. The rhythm of my feet on the pavement steadied me. I noticed how neighbors waved, how dogs barked, how the world went on, indifferent to my grief. In that indifference, I found something surprising: permission. Permission to stop orbiting around a son who no longer saw me. One evening, the phone rang. I stared at it, the name glowing on the screen, my son. For a moment, my heart lurched, old instincts tugging me toward hope. But hope felt like a trap now, a lure that had left me wounded before. I let it ring twice before I answered. His voice was casual, almost breezy, as if nothing had happened. He asked how I was, mentioned a new apartment they were settling into, described the neighborhood coffee shop he liked. I listened quietly, my hand gripping the receiver, and waited. Finally, I said it. "I know about the seating." The silence on the other end was sharp, like glass breaking. "I know about the whispers," I continued, my voice steady, "about how the bride's family thought I wasn't polished enough. And I know you let it happen." He stammered words, tripping over each other, excuses, half-hearted defenses. Something about how weddings are complicated, how compromises must be made, how appearances matter. Each phrase was another blade turned. But this time, I didn't flinch. "I will not beg for a place in your life," I said softly. "Not anymore." Silence again. Heavy weighted a silence that once would have panicked me. But I held it, let it stretch, let it choke him if it must. For the first time, I realized the power of withholding. Words had always been my offering, my lifeline, my way of smoothing conflict. But silence, my silence was its own shield. We ended the call without resolution. He didn't apologize. I didn't plead. The line went dead, and I sat in the stillness, breathing evenly. I was not triumphant, not relieved, but I was steady. That steadiness was new, and it felt like something close to dignity. The next day, I carried that steadiness with me. I went to the market, picked out apples, spoke kindly to the cashier. I noticed the sunlight slanting across the pavement, the ordinary beauty of the day. I realized how long I had lived bent beneath the weight of begging for belonging. Without that weight, the air felt different. At night, though, the anger still hummed. It came in waves, remembering the lasagna untouched, the prom suit sewn with bleeding fingers, the textbooks bought with aching teeth. Anger reminded me I had been wronged, and I needed that reminder. But beneath it, dignity rooted deeper. I began writing again, something I had abandoned years ago, when life became a treadmill of bills and exhaustion. I wrote about the wedding, about the chair with the white card, about the hiss of my son's voice. The words spilled out of me jagged and raw. When I finished, I read them aloud to the empty room, my voice trembling but firm. It was the first time I had spoken the truth without apology. Days later, I carried those words into a local writing group. The room was small. The chairs mismatched the lighting dim. Around me sat women with lined faces and tired eyes, women who carried their own invisible scars. When it was my turn, I unfolded the pages and began to read. My voice wavered at first, but as the story unspooled, the lasagna, the prom suit, the seating chart, my voice grew stronger. I saw nods around the table, eyes glistening with recognition. When I reached the end, the room was silent for a heartbeat, and then came the applause. Soft, gentle, not the roaring kind of weddings, but steady enough to fill the hollow inside me. That applause stitched me back together in places I hadn't known were torn. For the first time in a long time, I felt seen not as an embarrassment, not as background, but as a woman whose story mattered. Walking home that night, the cool air brushing my face, I thought about the difference between silence and voice. My son's silence had cut me down, but my own voice, spoken in that small room, had lifted me again. I did not feel healed, not yet. The wound was still raw. But I felt something even more important. I felt my dignity returning. Their claps stitched me back together. After the night, I read my piece aloud in that cramped writing circle. Something inside me shifted permanently. The applause had been quiet, polite, even, but it carried more weight than all the cheers at the wedding. Those claps were not about appearances. They were about truth. For the first time in years, I walked home with my shoulders straight. But dignity is fragile when it's newly born. It wavered when I came back to the silence of my house, the dark kitchen where the refrigerator hummed like an old friend. I poured myself a glass of water and sat at the table staring at the phone. My son hadn't called again. his absence pressed against me, daring me to chase it. I didn't. Instead, I wrote more. Every night, I filled pages with memories I had once swallowed whole. The look on the fiancé's face when she touched his arm and glanced at me the prom night when I pinned his boutonniere with trembling hands, the ache in my jaw from the tooth I had sacrificed for his textbooks. Writing pulled the grief out of me strand by strand like thorns removed from skin. Painful, yes, but cleansing. Still, life outside the page had to continue. I saw neighbors went to the grocery store, nodded to acquaintances who pretended not to know the whispers that had reached me. People in small towns notice everything, and what they don't notice, they invent. I carried myself carefully, holding my dignity like a candle in a draft. One afternoon, as I carried groceries into the house, the phone rang again. My son's name. I froze the paper bag cutting into my arm apples, rolling across the counter. I let it ring twice before I answered, keeping my voice level. "Hi, Mom," he said. His tone was softer this time, almost tentative. I waited. Silence stretched. Finally, he added, "You seemed upset the last time we talked." My laugh was short, sharp. Upset. The word sounded absurd. I was erased from your wedding, and you think I was merely upset. He muttered something about not wanting conflict about appearances. I closed my eyes, gripping the phone tighter. I wanted to shout to unleash every sacrifice I had cataloged in my journals, but shouting would have made me small. Instead, I spoke slowly, each word precise. "You chose to make me invisible," I said. "And you succeeded. But I will not live that way outside your choices." He said nothing. The silence this time was not mine. It was his, heavy and awkward, as though the truth had stripped him of language. I ended the call, gently placing the phone back in its cradle. For the first time, I did not feel abandoned. I felt in control. The writing group became my anchor. Each week, I read a new piece. The women around the table began to share their own stories: estranged children, forgotten anniversaries, empty nests filled with regret. We stitched each other together with words threadbare but strong. One evening, after group, I lingered with a woman named Grace. She was in her 70s, with hair the color of snow and eyes that had seen their share of storms. She told me about her daughter, who hadn't spoken to her in a decade. "You think you'll never survive the silence," Grace said, sipping her tea. "But you do. You even learned to make friends with it." Her words stayed with me. Maybe survival wasn't about forcing reconciliation. Maybe it was about building a life around the silence, decorating it with meaning, turning it into something less suffocating. I began gardening again, something I hadn't done since my son was young. I dug my hands into the soil, planted herbs and flowers, watched green shoots push through the dirt. Growth became my rebellion. Each sprout felt like a small defiance against erasure, yet the anger still visited, especially at night. I would wake sometimes, the memory of his "Hiss, Mom, you're embarrassing me," echoing in my ears. I would lie awake, fists clenched until dawn softened the edges. But the anger no longer swallowed me. It walked beside me, a reminder of where I had been. The true confrontation was not with him anymore. It was with myself, the part of me that had once believed sacrifice guaranteed love, that invisibility was the price of devotion. I had to look that part in the eye and say, "No more." One evening, I wrote a new piece titled "The Reserved Sign." It wasn't just about the wedding. It was about every moment I had been sidelined, dismissed, overlooked. I wrote it with precision, carving sentences like stone. When I finished, I read it aloud in my empty living room. My voice filled the walls, and for once, silence did not answer back. When I carried the piece to group the next week, the women listened, with their heads bowed, their eyes shining. When I reached the last line, "My seat is no longer borrowed. It is mine," the room erupted in soft applause, some even wiping tears. Walking home, I realized the confrontation had already happened. Not in a shouting match or a slammed door, but in the quiet refusal to remain erased. The night was cool, stars sharp above me. I looked up and thought, I may never have a place in his polished photos, but I have carved a place in my own story. And that perhaps was the only seat that ever truly mattered. My dignity no longer asked permission to sit down. I thought clarity had already arrived when I faced him on the phone, when I told him I would not beg for a place in his life. But life has a way of peeling back truth in layers, and just when I thought I had seen the whole picture, another corner lifted. It was late autumn when it happened. The leaves had already surrendered, curling on the sidewalks in shades of rust and brown. I stopped by the library to return a book, and as I walked past the bulletin board in the lobby, I noticed a familiar voice behind me. Two women, their coats dusted with cold, were talking about the wedding. I didn't recognize their faces, but I caught the names. They mentioned names from the bride's side of the family. Her mother insisted, one of them said the photos had to look refined. She didn't want, well, you know his mother up front. Too plain, too working class. The other woman clucked her tongue. I thought it was cruel, but they said it right to him. He agreed. Didn't put up a fight. I froze, my hand still pressed against the spines of books I wasn't really seeing. My breath hitched, and I ducked deeper into the aisle, as if hiding among the shelves might soften the words. He agreed. I had suspected as much. I had feared it in the quiet of my nights. But suspicion had always left me a sliver of hope, a chance to imagine he'd been trapped, that he'd been powerless. Now that hope evaporated. He hadn't been powerless. He had been complicit. I wandered the aisles in a daze, my hand trailing along the edges of books, the dust coating my fingers. Betrayal often begins quietly, but this was loud inside me, deafening. It rearranged everything. I no longer saw myself as merely excluded. I saw myself as sacrificed for the sake of their illusion of elegance. When I left the library, the cold air slapped my face, grounding me. I walked home slowly, each step measured. My son hadn't just failed to defend me, he had chosen not to. He had weighed me against their expectations and decided I was expendable. Back home, I sat at the table with a cup of tea. My hands shook as I lifted it, the steam curling upward like smoke from a fire I couldn't put out. For years, I had told myself that love was armor, that a mother's devotion was unassailable. But now, I understood devotion without respect is a chain, not protection. That night, I opened my journal again. The words came out hard, deliberate. He chose them. He chose their polish over my truth. He chose to erase me because it was easier than claiming me. Writing it down made it real, undeniable. I thought back to when he was a boy. The nights we sat together at the kitchen table. His homework spread out in messy piles, my coffee growing cold as I helped him parse equations and essays. He had looked at me with trust, then with dependence. And I had believed it would last, that such bonds could not fray. But adulthood had proved me wrong. Bonds can be severed not just by cruelty, but by convenience. The following Sunday, I went to church for the first time in months. I didn't go for faith, mine had thinned long ago, but for the rhythm of community. I sat in the back pew where no one asked questions, and I let the hymns wash over me. I didn't sing. I only listened, my throat too tight. The words about forgiveness felt hollow, almost offensive. Forgiveness was not ready to be born in me, but clarity was alive and pulsing. After the service, an acquaintance stopped me at the door. She had attended the wedding too. Her eyes were kind, but her words clumsy. I'm sorry about. You know how they treated you. People noticed. It wasn't fair. Her sympathy awkward as it was soothed me more than she knew. I thanked her, holding her gaze until she flushed and looked away. It was proof again. I hadn't imagined, it hadn't exaggerated. It was real and it was visible. That night, I didn't cry. I sat by the window watching the streetlights glow against the frost. The clarity no longer burned. It steadied me. My son had made his choice, and now I had to make mine. I would not chase him. I would not apologize for existing, and I would not sit in the back row of my own life. The next morning, I cleaned the house with a ferocity I hadn't felt in years. I scrubbed counters, washed curtains, polished the old wooden table. It wasn't about cleanliness. It was about reclaiming space. This was my house, my domain, where no one could push me to the margins. When I finished, I lit a candle in the center of the table and sat down. The flame flickered gently, steady and small. It was enough. The flame on the table was steadier than his love had ever been. After that day in the library, I carried the truth like a stone in my pocket, heavy, undeniable, shaping the way I moved through the world. Each time I touched it, I remembered he hadn't been overruled. He had agreed. He had decided I was expendable, and I had been edited out of the story willingly. I thought it would break me. Instead, it sharpened me. The weeks that followed felt like walking through a newly lit house. I noticed details I had ignored before, small ways he had prepared me for erasure. The missed phone calls, the sudden excuses when holidays drew near, the polite but clipped texts. Signs had been there all along, but I had blinded myself with love, convincing myself that distance was just busyness, that silence was just oversight. Now the mask had slipped, and clarity, though cruel, gave me power. One evening, I found myself flipping through the wedding invitation. It had sat in a drawer for months, half buried under envelopes and recipes. I held it up to the lamplight, reading the embossed script. Their names shimmered in gold, a union wrapped in glitter and polish. But nowhere on that card was there space for me. My name appeared only as a formality, mother of the groom, printed neatly in the program. Not honored, not present, just listed like an afterthought. I placed the invitation back in the drawer, but not with bitterness. It wasn't a treasure anymore. It was evidence that appearances had mattered more than blood, that paper could honor me more than my own son did in flesh. That night, I wrote again. My pen scraped hard against the page. Devotion without recognition is servitude. Love without respect is erasure. The words startled me when I read them back. For years, I had told myself a mother's love expected nothing in return. But what I had given hadn't been love anymore. It had been sacrifice, twisted into silence. The realization didn't erase the ache. I still woke some mornings with the echo of his voice. "Mom, you're embarrassing me," reverberating in my chest. But now the ache felt less like a wound and more like a scar forming. Painful. Yes, but a sign of healing. One afternoon, while buying stamps at the post office, I overheard a different kind of whisper. An older man in line recognized me. "You're the groom's mother, aren't you? Shame what happened at that wedding. Folks are still talking." I forced a smile polite, but inside something strange bloomed. They had tried to erase me, but in doing so, they had made me unforgettable. My absence had been louder than any presence I could have had. That irony comforted me. Even when I was invisible, I had been seen. I started walking to the library each week, not to overhear gossip, but to borrow memoirs. I read stories of women who had survived abandonment, betrayal, estrangement. Their words wrapped around me like blankets, proof that survival wasn't rare. Each story mirrored a shard of my own, different names, different settings, but the same quiet devastation, the same stubborn reclamation. The clarity grew roots. I began to understand that I didn't need to fight for a seat in his curated world. I needed to build my own table, one where my presence wasn't tolerated, but welcomed. So I invited 2 women from my writing group over for tea. We sat in my kitchen, the table polished, the candle lit. We laughed, shared stories, passed plates of cookies. Their eyes met mine with recognition, not judgment. I realized then this was my new front row. Not a seat near a bride, but a seat surrounded by truth. Still at night, I wrestled with bitterness. My journals filled with questions I couldn't silence. How could he agree? How could blood bend so easily to vanity? Sometimes I wrote his name again and again, the ink smudging as my hand trembled. But even in those moments, I no longer begged for answers. I wrote them as witness, not as plea. One Sunday, I walked past a bridal shop downtown. Gowns glowed in the window, satin and lace shimmering under fluorescent lights. I paused, staring. For a moment, I felt the sting of memory, the aisle, the reserved card, the camera flashes. But then I saw the mannequins, clearly lifeless, arranged perfect, but empty. I realized that had been the entire point. Perfection without substance. Appearances without heart. And suddenly, the sting eased. Because I knew I was not lifeless. I was not arranged. I was not perfect, but I was real. And reality, even with its wrinkles and scars, mattered more than any photograph. That evening, I returned to my garden. The first frost had touched the herbs, crisping their edges, but a few green shoots still stood tall. I knelt in the dirt, pulling weeds, my hands cold, but steady. Growth doesn't care about appearances. It pushes through anyway, stubborn, flawed, alive. I whispered into the soil, as if the earth itself could carry the message I am not expendable. And for the first time, I believed it. The frost had bitten the garden, but the roots held strong. Winter pressed hard that year, snow piling against the windows, the world outside muffled in white. Inside, my house carried its own silence, but it no longer felt like punishment. It was space empty, yes, but mine. I had learned to fill it with the scrape of my pen, the whistle of the kettle, the quiet companionship of books. And then he called again. I almost didn't answer. The phone rang 3 times, each chime cutting into the rhythm of my evening. I set down my pen, stared at the glowing name, and let my breath steady. Then I picked it up. His voice came through the line, hesitant, too casual. "Hi, Mom." "Hello." I said, my tone even. There was a pause, the kind that used to make me rush to fill the air. I didn't rush now. I let it stretch until he cleared his throat. "We're thinking of hosting a little dinner soon. Just a few friends. Maybe you'd like to come." The offer was flimsy, brittle. It wasn't an invitation of love. It was an extension of duty, a bandage over a wound too deep to hide. I closed my eyes, picturing the table. Would I sit at the edge again, smiling politely while conversation swirled around me, careful not to take up too much space? My stomach knotted at the thought. "I'll think about it," I said finally. He sighed, almost in relief. Good. She'll be glad to hear that. She. Not we. Not I. Just she. The line between us grew colder. I asked nothing more, and after a few pleasantries, the call ended. I sat in my chair, staring at the darkened window, my reflection faint against the glass. The invitation was nothing but a test, and I knew the answer before I spoke it aloud. To the empty room I would not go. The next day, I called him back. My hands shook slightly as I held the phone, but my voice was steady. I won't be coming, I said. He hesitated. Why not? Because I won't sit at the margins of my own family anymore. If you can't make space for me with dignity, then I will make space elsewhere. The silence that followed was jagged, as though the truth itself cut the line. He tried again, his words tumbling excuses, explanations about image, about compromise, about how things are complicated. No, I interrupted. My voice was firmer than I expected. Things are simple. You chose them over me, and I am choosing myself now. I heard him exhale sharply, a sound I had once mistaken for frustration with life, not with me. But now, I knew better. It was the sound of a man cornered by truth. You're being dramatic, he muttered. I laughed, a sound low and incredulous. No. For the first time in my life, I'm being honest. There was nothing left to say. I ended the call, my finger pressing the button with a finality that echoed through the quiet house. I set the phone down and waited for the ache to follow. It didn't. Instead, a strange calm settled over me. That evening, I returned to my writing group. The room was warm, filled with the scent of old paper and coffee. When it was my turn to share, I unfolded the pages I had written about the call. My voice did not waver. I told him I would not beg anymore. I read aloud. I told him the seat he denied me at his wedding no longer mattered, because I had found a seat of my own making. When I finished, the women around the table clapped softly, their faces alight with recognition. One reached across and squeezed my hand. That's strength, she whispered. Her words lodged in my chest, tender and fierce. For years, I had mistaken silence for strength. Now I knew the difference. Strength was not swallowing words. Strength was speaking them without fear of what followed. That night, I walked home through the snow. The air was sharp, my breath clouding in front of me. My boots crunched against the frozen ground, each step steady, deliberate. Above me, the stars burned cold and clear. I thought of him, of the woman he had married, of the family who had erased me, and for the first time, I did not feel small beneath their judgment. I felt vast. The world stretched wide around me, indifferent and infinite. Somewhere within it, I had carved my place, however modest. A seat at my own table, a voice in my own story. When I reached home, I lit the candle on the kitchen table, the flame flickering steady against the dark. I sat there for a long time, watching it burn, feeling its quiet defiance mirror my own. The flame on the table no longer flickered for him. It burned for me. After that last phone call, something inside me settled like a stone, finding its place at the bottom of a river. The turbulence quieted. The ache was still there, but it no longer controlled me. It had been transformed into something else, a core of resolve I hadn't known I possessed. I kept writing. Not just about the wedding, but about everything that had led me there, the years of sacrifice, the subtle dismissals, the moments I had silenced myself to keep peace. I poured it all onto the page, letting the ink bear the weight my heart could no longer carry. Each entry was like laying another brick in a foundation that finally belonged to me. The writing group became my refuge. On Tuesday evenings, I walked into that modest room with its mismatched chairs and coffee-stained carpet, and I felt whole. The women there understood the language of betrayal. They didn't flinch at silence, didn't dismiss tears, didn't ask me to explain why I hurt. They already knew. One night, I brought my longest piece, yet nearly 10 pages, titled The Reserved Sign. It traced everything: the lasagna left untouched, the sewing machine needle that pricked my fingers, the textbooks I had chosen over my own dental care, and finally, the silver card that erased me on his wedding day. When I read it aloud, my voice was steady. The room fell silent, not out of indifference, but reverence. When I finished, there was a pause, and then applause that filled the space like balm. Some women wiped their eyes. One whispered, "You told my story too." That night, walking home beneath the street lamps, I realized what had begun. My words weren't just for me anymore. They were for every woman who had been pushed aside, every mother told she was embarrassing, every voice silenced for the sake of appearances. I started attending the library's open mic nights. The first time I stood at the podium, my knees shook so badly I thought I might collapse. But once I began reading, the fear melted away. The audience, a mix of students, retirees, lonely souls searching for connection, listened with an intensity I hadn't expected. When I spoke the line, "My seat is no longer borrowed, it is mine," a murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Afterward, a young woman approached me. She hugged her notebook to her chest and said, "I didn't know you could tell the truth like that out loud." "Thank you." Her words warmed me more than any apology from my son could have. She saw me, not as an embarrassment, not as excess, but as someone worth listening to. The following weeks, I wrote with renewed purpose. I stopped shaping my words to sound gentle or acceptable. I let them be raw, jagged, true. It felt like opening windows in a house that had been shuttered for years. Fresh air rushed in, and though it stung at first, it brought life with it. The garden outside mirrored the shift. Despite the cold, I tended it, covering roots with mulch, tucking bulbs into the soil for spring. Each act of care was a promise to myself: there will be growth again. Friends from the writing group began visiting more often. We shared meals, laughter, even silence that didn't sting. My kitchen table, once a place of loneliness, became a gathering spot. I realized I no longer longed for a reserved seat at someone else's table. I had created my own. One afternoon, as I sorted through old boxes in the attic, I found the lasagna dish I had carried to his apartment years ago. The glass was chipped at the corner, but it gleamed in the light. I held it in my hands and smiled, not with bitterness, but with recognition. That dish had been a gift he never accepted, but it was still mine. My care, my effort, my love, they had always been mine to give. His rejection no longer defined them. I carried the dish downstairs, washed it carefully, and placed it on a shelf where I could see it daily. Not as a relic of pain, but as a reminder of who I was. A woman who had always given, who had always created nourishment, even when it went unappreciated. That evening, I baked a lasagna for myself and 2 women from the group. We sat together, eating, laughing, talking about books and gardens and memories. As I served them, I realized that sharing that meal felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. The lasagna no longer symbolized rejection. It symbolized resilience. I thought of him briefly, of how he would never know this moment, never understand the quiet revolution unfolding at my table. For once, the thought didn't wound me. It freed me. When the women left and the house grew quiet again, I lit the candle on the table. The flame flickered steady and bright. I opened my journal and wrote one last line before bed: I no longer wait for a seat. I build my own table. I closed the journal, feeling peace settle over me like a blanket. The lasagna finally fed someone who savored every bite, including me. Winter loosened its grip slowly. By March, patches of earth appeared between the shrinking snowbanks, dark and damp, promising life beneath. I found myself lingering by the window each morning, coffee warming my palms, watching for the first hint of green in the garden. Grief was still with me, but it had changed its shape. It no longer tore through me like a storm. It sat quietly beside me like an old companion. I carried it without flinching, acknowledging its weight, but no longer collapsing under it. One afternoon, I walked into town, the sun weak but welcome on my face. I stopped outside the bridal shop again. The gowns glowed beneath the glass, perfect and lifeless, their lace stiff under fluorescent light. Months ago, the sight would have sent me spiraling. Now I stood calmly, my breath misting the glass, and thought, those dresses may dazzle, but they will never know the work of real hands. I saw my own hands then lined, scarred strong. They had sewn seams, late at night stirred sauce until it simmered just right. Folded shirts, signed checks steadied a trembling child. These hands had not been polished for photographs, but they had built a life. They had built him. The clarity steadied me further. My son's choices still hurt, but the sting had dulled. I no longer felt erased. I felt transformed. The absence of his recognition no longer defined me. What defined me were the roots I had planted elsewhere in writing circles and friendships in the soil of my garden. That spring, I joined a memoir workshop at the library. The instructor, a woman with silver hair and a laugh that filled the room, encouraged us to write, not just for survival, but for record. Your stories, she said, are artifacts. They matter. They outlast rejection. I wrote furiously chapter after chapter, piecing together not just the betrayal, but the years of sacrifice that had preceded it. I wrote about my childhood, about motherhood, about the ways women are asked to disappear. With each page, I felt less invisible. My words had weight. They proved I had lived fully, painfully, beautifully. On the last day of the workshop, we gathered to share excerpts. I read the section about the reserved seat at the wedding. My voice was calm even. When I finished, there was a hush. Then the instructor leaned forward, her eyes wet. That, she said, is truth on paper. Don't stop. I carried those words home like a blessing. That evening, I tended to the garden, pushing my fingers into the thawed earth. Shoots of green were emerging, fragile but determined. I pressed the soil gently around them, whispering encouragement as if they were children. Growth is quiet but relentless. It reminded me of myself. Later, I opened the box I had kept tucked away in the closet. Inside were artifacts of the past, the wedding invitation, old birthday cards, photographs of him as a boy with a smile wide as sunlight. I sifted through them slowly, each piece carrying both love and loss. For a moment, the grief sharpened. I missed him, not the man he had become, but the boy he once was. The boy who had fallen asleep in the back seat after football practice, who had slipped his small hand into mine at crowded school concerts. That boy was gone, replaced by someone who saw me as a liability. But instead of breaking me, the grief settled. I placed the invitation back in the box alongside the photographs and cards. I closed the lid carefully, not as an act of denial, but as an act of preservation. These pieces of history no longer dictated my worth. They were simply evidence of a life I had lived. I tucked the box back into the closet and stood quietly in the dim light. My heart hurt, but it also felt steady. I could live with both. That night, I lit the candle on the kitchen table. I watched the flame sway gently, its glow reflecting in the glass lasagna dish I had placed nearby. Symbols of rejection had become symbols of reclamation. The flame was not for him, not anymore. It was for me, for the woman who had survived invisibility and carved her way back into view. I sat for a long time in that stillness, the house wrapped around me like a cocoon, and for the first time, the silence did not ache. It simply was. The silence no longer felt like absence, it felt like peace. Spring arrived in earnest, the kind of spring that smelled of damp earth and lilacs pushing through fences. My garden flourished. Tulips opened wide, defiant splashes of red and yellow against the green. I knelt in the soil one morning, dirt under my nails, and realized I hadn't thought of the wedding in days. The memory was still there, but it no longer burned. It lingered like an old scar, tender if pressed, but healed enough not to throb on its own. The writing group decided to host a small reading at the library. We invited friends, neighbors, even strangers passing by. The room was full of folding chairs and anticipation. When it was my turn, I stood at the podium, the pages of the reserved sign trembling slightly in my hands. I read the words aloud, my voice steady, my story unflinching. I looked up once, midway, and caught sight of faces listening, really listening. Some frowned in sympathy, some nodded in recognition. And in that moment, I knew I had done something larger than reclaiming my own voice. I had carved a path for others to follow, showing that truth could live in the open, not just in the shadows of journals. Afterward, people came up to me, a woman with gray curls, who said her daughter no longer called a man, who whispered that his own mother had died before he ever apologized. They touched my arm, pressed my hand, and thanked me. Each thank you stitched me tighter into the fabric of a community that had always been there, waiting for me to see it. At home that night, I placed the copy of my story into the box with the wedding invitation. Not as surrender, but as balance. The invitation represented the erasure. The story represented the reclamation. Side by side, they told the truth of my life, betrayal and survival, both real, both mine. One morning, I received a letter in the mail. The envelope was unfamiliar, the handwriting neat. Inside was a note from the memoir instructor congratulating me on my progress and urging me to keep writing. She enclosed a flyer for a regional anthology seeking submissions. I traced the paper with my fingers, my heart steady. The idea of my words living in a book printed, bound, shared, filled me with a quiet thrill. Not revenge, not vindication, just affirmation. I spent the next week polishing my piece. I cut lines, sharpened phrases, breathed life into sentences. It felt like tending to the garden, trimming, nurturing, coaxing growth. When I sealed the envelope and slid it into the mailbox, I felt lighter. Whatever happened, accepted or not, I had declared myself. That evening, I cooked lasagna again. The dish gleamed under the oven light, the scent filling the house. This time, I invited no one. I ate alone, each bite rich, comforting. I thought of my mother, who had taught me the recipe, and felt her presence in the flavors. I thought of the years I had given my son, and accepted that they were still mine, even if he had discarded them. Later, I sat in the garden with a cup of tea, watching twilight settle. The first fireflies blinked among the tulips. A breeze rustled the leaves soft as a lullaby. My heart felt quiet, not because it was empty, but because it was full of my own presence. I no longer longed for a reserved seat at anyone's table. I had built my own, and in its center stood not shame, not silence, but dignity. I rose, went inside, and lit the candle on the kitchen table. Its flame glowed against the window, a beacon not for him, not for anyone else, but for me. This was my stillness. This was my peace. The candle's glow no longer asked to be seen, it was enough just to burn.